Hello and welcome back. This is the week 5 lecture. So today we're talking about cinema and genre. That's the reading for this week. So really, we're just focusing on the development of movie genres, which I thought would be a pretty relatable process. We're going to talk about the origins of genre in movies, but I would also like us to make some contemporary connections, think about how genre continues to work today. We're going to notice several examples of genres that were around back then and are still around. We still have them. They've, of course, changed in different ways over the years, but we can track some of those. We can also talk about some newer genres, or at least think about them. And our film for this week is A Night in Casablanca. That's a Marx Brothers movie. I've went ahead and posted another Marx Brothers film to this week's module, Duck Soup, which is a much earlier film. Came out in 1933, whereas our, A Night in Casablanca was, I believe, 46, right after the war. If you guys have time, I would recommend watching both. A Night in Casablanca is a later Marx Brothers movie. I chose it for two reasons. It appears in the book, and also it's a really good example of how movies can play around with genre conventions, like certain generic elements, and do kind of new or fun things with them. But I kind of was getting to think about it a little bit more, and I think the genre that they're riffing on in that movie is not going to be super familiar to a lot of modern humans, and then two, it's really not one of their best films. So I included Duck Soup in case you guys wanted to go back to kind of the glory years of the Marx Brothers when they were at the height of their comedic powers. That's probably their masterpiece. You could also maybe check out Animal Crackers or Horse Feathers or A Night at the Opera. Their best decade really was the 30s. So we are seeing them in the 40s. It's actually their second to last movie. They're older. I mean, they're still good, but their film careers were kind of winding down by the late 40s. So I thought it might be nice to look at them at the peak of their careers back in the 30s. But if you don't have time to watch a second Marx Brothers movie, that's fine. You can just stick with A Night in Casablanca. But they were, of course, very popular comedians. They started out in vaudeville. They also did radio stuff, but they're mostly known for their film work. So we can talk about them and that particular, our film as sort of an example of comedy, but kind of a specific genre of comedy that maybe doesn't necessarily exist anymore, at least not in quite the same form. So we'll get to that later in the lecture. So I want to start just by covering our one chapter, our one article really, that we are reading this week. Starts on page 276, called Cinema and Genre. Relatively short reading. We have a lighter reading load this week, just this one piece. We're going to actually wait and check out some of the more specific stuff on individual genres like Westerns. They have a little bit more on musicals and some other genres that we're going to talk about later. For now, we can just cover this kind of, more broad overview that they provide in this 10-page chapter that I assigned. So they're just giving you a little bit more background and understanding of genre, and I think it's fun to think about genre. I hope at least some of you agree, because again, we all know movie genres. You don't even have to be a huge movie watcher to be familiar with some of the most popular genres that we have when it comes to movies. And since a lot of you have taken English classes in recent years as well, you can see the kind of obvious crossover with literary genres. So we often learn about genres in literature classes when we talk about, romances or adventure, maybe sci-fi. We talk about some older genres that aren't around anymore necessarily, but we also see a lot of genres that have persisted. So they mention this in the book. They kind of give you the origin of the word genre. It literally means, kind or type. So in a broad sense, we use the idea of genre as a classification system, a way to organize different narratives into different groups or classifications. And generally, humans like to do this sort of work. We like to organize things. We like to rank things. We like to put things in different categories. It just helps us to understand, the subject of our analysis. So we often talk about genre with literature, and as they point out in the book, genre can be used actually in a lot of different ways. So if we're just thinking about books to start, or any kind of literature really, you can refer to stuff as like epic. You can, again, not using it like as just an adjective, but describing a type of writing. Epics kind of comprise their own specific genre. They're a very ancient genre. They're still around, I guess, in some form, but we could talk about epics. We could also talk about lyric poetry. Now, that's a very specific type of poetry that's maybe different from narrative poetry. So if we talk about epics or drama or lyric, we're talking about the style of presentation. That's how they put it in the book. So we're using genre to refer to the different ways that these art forms are presented to audiences. So an epic is going to look and sound different than a lyric poem. And a dramatic performance on stage will certainly look and sound different than both. So these are all different presentation styles, different ways of conveying the narrative to an audience. So we can use that concept to divide them up into different genres, but we can also use their relationship to reality. And again, we especially do this with books, right? We have fiction on one hand and nonfiction on the other. So typically we understand fiction to mean that these stories are made up. They are not meant to be true. They are not meant to be taken as the truth. Whereas nonfiction is supposed to be true. It's supposed to be real. So we use a very basic generic differentiation there to, be able to distinguish between what is true versus what has largely been made up by the author. So we're all kind of familiar with that, but we know that the way we typically use genre the most is to refer basically to the different types of plot and the different kinds of subject matter that we encounter when we read narratives. So just to kind of run through some of the most common genres that we know, think about horror, think about drama, which is really an offshoot of the old melodrama genre that we're going to talk about more today. We've already talked about it a little bit before. Comedy, science fiction, right? Westerns, war movies, mystery, thrillers. A lot of these genres that we use, both for books and for movies, maybe even TV shows as well, they'll either refer to the type of plot that the narrative has, or they'll just refer in a kind of more general way to the subject matter of the narrative. So if we're talking about a war movie or a Western, we're really just referring in a very general way to subject matter. This is a movie about a war. It's taking place during a war. This is a Western. It takes place in the West, right? Very, very general, very broad way of classifying. But then we might also refer to, a thriller or a mystery movie or a mystery novel. We're really talking more about their plots, right? The plot of the mystery novel revolves around a mystery that the characters and, of course, the readers or viewers want to solve. Or in a thriller, the plot is very thrilling. It features a lot of thrills, a lot of excitement, adventure, action, but also suspense, maybe moments of fear, right? But we're really just describing the type of plot that we're going to be dealing with in that particular narrative. So if you think about it just in those terms, genre might seem very simple, right? It's just a simple classification system that we all use. It's almost like a shorthand when we're talking about books or movies, just a word that we can use to basically tell other people what it's about or the general subject matter that it's dealing with. But as the book points out, genre is actually a lot more complex because it drives a lot of audience expectations. So one thing we will mention at least briefly in lecture, because it gets talked about a lot in the chapter, is this idea of the spectator and how genre affects spectators. So they use the term generic spectatorship in the book rather, which is just a complex way of saying, let's think about audiences and how genre affects audiences. And more importantly, how genre really can help to shape the viewing experience. Genre really drives much of the ways that we, perceive movies, the way that we understand what we're seeing, the way we evaluate movies, the way we decide whether or not we like them, the way we experience them, interact with them. So that's the more interesting part of genre, and we'll get to that soon. But if we want to think a little bit just about the history and how it worked in the very early days of cinema, the book points out that in the very early years, individual movies were more often referred to by their length. Like, was it a 1 reel, a 2 reel? Was it a story movie? Sometimes they would be distinguished as story pictures versus, those really early films that didn't have narratives. They were just showing everyday events. So the idea of genre was very loose back then, and it wasn't super important until a little bit later, until the Hollywood studio system really took over and started to standardize a lot of these conventions of movies. But early on, it was loose, and what genres we did have were largely imported from the stage. So we've talked about this before. Early movies were kind of reliant on the theater, both for their actors' supply. They would later import playwrights to write screenplays for movies, and even a lot of the ideas, a lot of the premises of early movies would just be imported from popular stage plays. They'd be like remakes or sort of slightly different versions of plays. So we've, I think, mentioned before that the two dominant genres of 19th century theater were typically melodrama and comedy. And those genres got imported to early film, and of course we see a lot of examples of both. But in time, those genres would become a little bit more, sort of diverse. You would have more subcategories within them. So we've already kind of mentioned that even melodrama as a sort of big, broad genre, it would sort of get broken up into smaller categories later on as it got adapted to more and more movies. You would sort of have two different kinds of melodrama. You would have different kinds of comedy. And that's part of the development of genre. People started to think more about these conceptual categories, and they started to become a little bit more nuanced and complex. But again, initially, a lot of the terminology was just borrowed from plays and novels. So comedies, romance, melodrama. We already had those genres, even war stories, right? Those existed at least in fiction. Westerns had already kind of existed, at least in popular fiction. But there were some new categories, some new genres that were being developed largely as a result of cinematic technology. Things that were unique to film that really hadn't necessarily existed with other art forms before. So they mention a few of these in the book, like trick films. That would be little short movies kind of centered around camera tricks, which were pretty popular, in the very early 1900s. Or a chase film, which would be, a short narrative maybe just consisting of somebody getting chased. Or an animated film, which of course was something pretty unique to the cinema. Newsreels, even, that was a genre. Those weren't like fiction films. Those were little brief news programs that would often show in the theater before the feature film, and they would just provide a little bit of a news update for the audience. But that was a particular kind of film. It was different than a chase film. It was different than a melodrama, different than a comedy. So we started to differentiate more and more. And then they say after World War One, so like the very end of the 19 teens, heading into the 1920s, genres become much more specialized. They become a lot more specific. But again, a lot of them still originate from those two classic theater genres of melodrama and comedy. But another interesting thing to consider is that genre wasn't just important to producers and directors and the creative types who were involved in the production level of filmmaking, but genre was also important to distributors and exhibitors, those other levels of filmmaking, because largely genre would be used to market films. And in time, Hollywood studio executives came to view genre as one of the best ways to sell movies and one of the best ways to ensure that a particular film would be successful and make money. So that's another thing to consider, right? They would utilize genre for more than just like creative purposes. It was being used for business purposes as well, and it was also being used to sort of attract viewers, to sort of understand audiences and to try to give audiences what they wanted. But one really interesting thing they go through in the chapter, I just wanted to spend a little bit of time on it, was the sort of early naming convention that they used for genres. And just because this is a class being taught by an English professor, I wanted to take a moment, and we'll talk more about words and sentences later when we get to the whole semantics and syntax thing. But I just wanted to think about the early way of naming genres and how it changed, because it's a really easy thing to understand if you break it down. So they mentioned that early on, like when we first started using genre, distributors would often use an adjective and a noun when sort of describing the genre of a movie. So, for example, they would call something a Western melodrama or a musical attraction. So just notice the sort of construction of these terms, right? We have an adjective and a noun. So in the example of Western melodrama, Western is the adjective being used to modify the noun, which is melodrama. So again, melodrama back then was a genre that most audiences were familiar with because it existed in novels, it existed in plays, it had a long history. So that's the centerpiece of the description, at least initially. This is a particular type of melodrama. This is a Western melodrama. It's set in the West, it has certain characteristics of the West, but first and foremost, it is a melodrama. So initially, the primary focus would be put on the noun, and the adjective is just modifying the noun. But as they point out, over time, the noun got dropped, and the adjective became more important, and the adjective could just kind of stand alone as the name of the genre. So instead of musical attraction, we drop the noun attraction, that's pretty vague, and now we're just going to call it a musical. And in time, people would know what that meant. Instead of calling it a Western melodrama, we drop melodrama and we just call it a Western. So the adjective in many cases is enough. People came to understand what it meant. But like they say in the book, it took some time, right? Even for a sort of classic genre, a classic movie genre like the musical, right? It really wasn't until the beginning of the 1930s that audiences would have identified these types of movies as musicals, because previously they would have been called a lot of different things. They would have been called a musical something, musical entertainment, a musical talkie, a musical melodrama, a musical comedy, perhaps, a musical attraction. But in time, musical, that adjective, came to stand in for the entire genre. So that takes time. It takes time to kind of train the audience to understand what that genre is supposed to be. But that's what's happening throughout the 1920s, 1930s, and by the time we really get to sort of peak Hollywood golden age filmmaking, these genres are pretty well established. And each genre will have its own sort of formulas or templates, its own conventions that audiences would come to recognize. And filmmakers would try to sort of stick to those conventions in a lot of cases. If you're making a comedy, well, you got to have certain things. If you're making a Western, you need to have certain elements in place so people know it's a Western. So again, that's pretty simple to understand, but it drives a lot of complex viewership patterns if we're talking about spectators, if we're talking about viewers. So they go into kind of how genre functions on each different level of filmmaking, starting with production. And again, this is typically where we think about genre doing the most work. It provides these templates, these formulas for screenwriters, for directors, really for everybody who works on a film. If you're making a Western, I'm going to keep using the Western example because it's a classic genre. The book talks about it a lot. I understand that many of you might not watch many Westerns. It's a genre often associated with, people's dads. I know my own dad watched a lot of Westerns and war movies. So when I was young, those were two genres that I got exposed to a lot because he would watch a lot of classic Hollywood Westerns. But you can fill in the blank. You can talk about any genre, horror films, right? They all kind of work this way. If you're making one of these types of movies, there's certain things you need to include in the screenplay, right? There are certain things the cinematographer might want to do when it comes to camera work. There's certain things you're going to do with lighting. There's certain things you're going to do with music, with costumes, with makeup, with editing. You can go down the line. It really influences almost every component of production. They even mentioned the casting director. If you're making a horror film, you might want certain types of actors, right? If you guys notice, a lot of actors will show up in a lot of the same kinds of genre films, right? Because they work well for that genre. This might not be quite as true today as it was in previous decades when actors were more typecast, but you might want a scary looking guy to be in your horror film, right? Or you might want somebody who looks like a cowboy and can ride a horse to be in your Western film. So it influences casting, it influences the way the movie looks, it influences the screenplay, the way characters talk, the plot, the way the plot is developed is very much going to be influenced by the type of genre that it is. And they even mention in some cases, and this was more true in the classic Hollywood era, some stuff would even get recycled, like certain stock footage. Like if you watch classic Westerns from like the 40s or 50s, you'll notice that certain like majestic vistas of the mountains and desert, they look a lot alike in a lot of different movies. And in some cases, it might be very similar or even identical footage of Monument Valley or something, or some, Western landmark in Utah or California where they filmed a lot of Westerns, and that stuff would show up in a lot of different movies or sound effects, or even certain kinds of music could kind of get recycled, because if it worked for one Western or if it worked for one thriller, it could probably work for some others. So it made production in some cases a lot easier and a lot more streamlined. As they point out, this is kind of a part of that factory precision, sort of assembly line style that Hollywood develops over the course of the 20s and 30s. They would move away from some of the assembly line stuff, but they still wanted to make movies efficiently, rather quickly, and genre helped them to do that. But also genre matters on the level of distribution and exhibition, like we were saying. So on the distribution level, it provides what we can call product differentiation. And that's important when you're trying to sell a movie, when you're trying to sell it to exhibitors so they can show it. You have to have an easy shorthand for describing the movie, and you need to be able to show how this movie is different from other movies. So genre allows one to do that. And then on the exhibition level, again, this is all about audiences. So when you're actually a theater chain owner and you're buying movies from distributors to play at your theater, you need to think about audience. You need to think about what the viewers expect, what they want. So obviously, what are the most popular genres? And then when you're deciding on a particular movie, you might be thinking, how well does this movie conform to the genre standards? It's supposed to be a Western, but is it really capturing all of those Western elements in a way that my viewers will like? So it matters on all levels. And they mentioned this kind of shift that happens over the course of the 20s into the 30s, where we move away from thinking of genre as strictly content-based. Like, it's strictly about what's happening in the movie, and we start to think of it in a slightly more sophisticated way. Again, we still kind of think about it just in terms of plot or subject matter, but we start to add a little bit more to our understanding of genre. So we start to understand genre definitions based more on like plot motifs, like recurring features that show up in a lot of, say, Westerns. A little bit more sophisticated than just it's in the West, so it's a Western, but now it's more about certain character types, certain types of plots, certain kinds of visuals, like recurring images. A little bit more sophisticated than just, oh, here's what's happening. We want certain types of themes. We want certain types of symbolism, right? So it's a little bit more than just subject matter. Now it's about plot, character, cinematography, but also we're thinking about the thematic level, right? A lot of Westerns might express similar themes. So that's what we're looking for when we sit down to watch a Western. So as audiences became more savvy about genre, exhibitors, distributors, and everybody else involved in movie making had to as well, because you're ultimately trying to satisfy the audience. So yeah, genre evolves and changes. They use the example of The Great Train Robbery, which we watched back in week 1, a very early narrative film from the very beginning of the 20th century. It's often thought of as one of the first Westerns. But as they point out in the book, audiences back then, when it first came out, wouldn't have really understood it necessarily as a Western. It would have probably been called a Western melodrama, right? It was a melodrama first and foremost, and it was very much imported from the stage in terms of like how it was shot, how it was plotted, how it was presented to audiences. So like we talked about in weeks prior, it was sort of filmed in that classic proscenium style that was very much influenced by stage plays, where the action just takes place in front of a static camera, very little camera movement, it's not very dynamic, everything looks like it would on a stage, essentially. So both because of that reason and just the nature of the story, the way it was presented, the character types, audiences would have thought of it as a melodrama. Because a lot of melodramas on the stage might have featured sort of adventure, criminal acts, sort of death-defying moments, kind of over-the-top emotions. So they would have identified it as a recognizable genre, right? And to sort of further specify what kind of melodrama it was, you could call it a Western melodrama. It takes place in the West. But in time, we drop melodrama and it's a Western, right? And it would influence future Westerns, but as the book says, that would kind of take a little bit longer. Initially, it influenced more like crime movies. But that's another genre that we recognize today. Narratives that are kind of centered around criminal activity, like a heist film or gangster movies, right? That's a recognizable genre that still exists today. So genres change and morph, but we can also find a lot of commonality and a lot of similarity between then and now. So yeah, just a final note. Well, this will kind of get us into a larger discussion that I wanted to have about spectatorship and about the ways that genre affect us as viewers. So they mentioned that exhibitors would, and I think we can kind of understand this, that exhibitors aren't really thinking of individual viewers as individuals. They're thinking about audiences more as sort of anonymous, faceless groups or big blocks of people. Because ultimately you are marketing a movie, you are exhibiting a movie to a lot of people, a lot of different people, frankly. So it doesn't really benefit you from a business standpoint to get too in the weeds about individual characteristics that all of these different people in your audience are going to possess. Instead, you want to focus on what makes them similar, right? What do they want? And again, a lot of that boils down to genre. So the way genre names would get used, the imagery, the plot motifs, again, the character types that we see in movies, they were largely geared towards satisfying what audiences liked and what audiences wanted. So yes, genres are a shorthand that help us classify and help us to kind of quickly understand what type of book or movie we're dealing with, but they also influence a lot of our viewing or reading experience. We're going to measure a text or a movie largely by how well they adhere to certain genre conventions that we expect them to follow. And in other cases, we might be excited when they violate those genre conventions, when they do something different, when they do something novel. But we can only appreciate the way that they're departing from genre if we know what the rules are for that genre. We can't appreciate the new stuff unless we appreciate the way the genre traditionally worked in the past. So an understanding of genre is always important, no matter what we're reading or what we're watching. But they also mentioned, just beyond that stuff, genre also kind of creates this whole promotional side, and we've already kind of thought about that a little bit, but this is another thing that we can see still today. The way movies get promoted, the way they get marketed is largely based on genre. But also they mention specialized support systems. And this book is a little bit dated, right? Our book came out in the 90s. So they mention newspaper columns, fan clubs, commercial products, cartoons and other artwork, magazines, and books. They say all of these different sort of specialized support systems are, again, based on genre. And I think you guys know what that means, because there are magazines, or nowadays maybe websites, online magazines that are devoted to horror or sci-fi or other types of genres, fantasy. Being popular examples today, and other times there might have been different genres that were championed, but we still see that, right? We still see those kinds of support systems. A lot of it today exists online, of course, that's what they're failing to take into account, but I think we can find evidence of those support systems still in existence, and again, they're largely based around genre identification. So they go back to literature for a moment and they say, anybody who's familiar with literary genres know that these certain genre concepts, the rules of a genre, the conventions of a genre, like I've said, will always sort of influence how we read, or with movies, how we watch. But it's important to keep in mind that not all films are using generic knowledge or using genres in the same way. So some movies are just going to borrow or recycle familiar genre conventions that we've seen before. And they're just going to sort of bring them back, and it's fun because we like that kind of movie. Whereas other movies might actually foreground these sort of generic characteristics, these conventions of genre. They're going to foreground the genre itself in such a way that the genre ends up sort of playing its own role in the movie. So the example I would use of this would be the Scream franchise. If you guys have seen any of those movies, or even if you're just familiar with them, that's kind of what is happening there. So Scream, like all of those movies, are horror films, right? I mean, in a very broad sense, but they're also very much commenting on the horror genre. I haven't seen a lot of the more recent ones, but that's very much what the first one does, and that's what made it kind of novel and fun when it came out back in the 90s, around the same time this book was published. But it was very much kind of making fun of certain genre conventions, particularly what we find in like slasher movies, right? So we have a group of young, attractive people who are getting picked off one by some mysterious killer. And again, we've seen that plot. We've seen those character types in so many older horror movies that when Scream came out, I think in 96, everybody recognized those genre characteristics. Okay, yeah, we've seen this. But in Scream, the characters were aware. The characters themselves knew about those genre conventions. They sat around and watched horror movies. So they kind of understood what was happening. They were a lot more self-aware than the classic teen characters in older slasher films. So they would even comment upon certain plot points or things that you would expect to find in a horror movie. So it had some comedic elements, and it was kind of fun in that way, but it was also still meant to be scary. And it was still meant to make you jump and keep you on the edge of your seat. So a term that's often used to kind of refer to movies like that are really commenting on their genre and foregrounding it. We often call these meta-fiction, meta-fictional, which just means and it doesn't have to be a movie. Books can do this too, but it's just any kind of narrative or work of fiction that sort of calls attention to its fictionality. A lot of, traditional, more realistic fiction, whether it's in book form or movie, they want to sort of make everything seem real, right? They don't want to call attention to the fact that this is fiction. It's all made up. They want readers to or viewers to take it as real, to treat it seriously, to take it seriously, even if it's a comedy, right? We're supposed to laugh, but we need to sort of take the characters to be somewhat real, or we can relate to them or recognize them in some way. But metafiction is fine with calling attention to the fact that it is made up, it is fictional, and they can kind of have fun with it. And again, what it's often doing is sort of having fun with these genre conventions or these familiar elements that show up in a particular genre. They're making use of that stuff, but they're also kind of pointing to it and saying, hey, you guys recognize this, right? This is fun. We know this. Maybe we're going to do something slightly different with it, or maybe we're just going to have a character acknowledge it or talk about it instead of being totally clueless. So if you know the Scream franchise, that kind of makes sense. But I would argue that there's lots of contemporary films that do that. There's a lot of contemporary films that comment on the genre that they belong to. And it's kind of done in a winking, often comic way, and it's delivered very much for the sake of viewers. It's there for a certain kind of knowledgeable viewer who's also knowledgeable about the genre, and they sort of get the jokes, but they can also still be invested in those genre conventions that they can also kind of laugh at. So it's a little bit of a complex position that spectators now assume, but I think a lot of you kind of understand it because you've been there yourselves. So the book, again, it gets really into the weeds about generic spectatorship and how it works. We don't have to become experts, but you might want to look at the different types of generic spectatorship that they list on page 280. Just try to understand some of that stuff. But, just understand also that audiences are trained to respond, to certain generic cues. They're trained to understand generic plots and how they're supposed to work. Different genres have different kinds of plots that we're going to recognize. And another interesting point that the book makes, and I think it's worth considering more, is that genres will also allow us, in some cases, to tolerate bad behavior, like violent or antisocial behavior that we would never tolerate in real life. But in a certain genre of movie, it's fine. So the easiest way to think about this would be a gangster movie, right? Which many people like, and we are literally watching criminals commit criminal, often violent acts. But because these criminals are often positioned as protagonists, or at least somewhat likable characters, we might find ourselves cheering them on and supporting them as they commit crimes, something that we might not ordinarily do. But our allegiance to the genre, the book points out, the allegiance to the genre sometimes wins out over like social standards and norms. So normally we don't endorse crime. But in a gangster movie, if we like the characters, maybe we do. They use a more obscure example in the book of a musical with Fred Astaire and Ginger Rogers from the 30s. It's okay if you're not all that familiar with what they're talking about, but it is interesting just as a thought experiment. Again, you kind of have to put yourself in a previous era, but they're making the point that in this 30s musical, the Ginger Rogers character is kind of unfaithful to her husband because she's into the Fred Astaire character. And they're pointing out that in the 30s, almost a century ago, that would have been considered, very socially unacceptable behavior. I guess even today, it probably still would be. But in the movie, we are rooting for these two characters. We want them to get together, right? Even though it seems wrong that she's, going off with Fred Astaire on some cruise or whatever and not hanging out with her husband. So that's not like socially acceptable behavior. But because this is a romantic musical, this is a musical featuring this relationship between the two leads, we want them to get together, even though that might be a violation of social norms. So that's kind of fun to think about. Genre does cause us to do that a lot. You can think about romance, you could think about westerns, but again, the most obvious examples would be crime movies, or any time we're sort of rooting for a character who is acting in a way that we would never accept in real life. So you can probably find some examples of that. And again, just to drive it home, studio executives and also distributors and exhibitors viewed genre as essential to business. And they would often chalk up, the individual success of a movie to its adherence to genre, not the creativity of the director or the screenwriter or great performances by the actor. They would say, no, this movie was successful because it stuck to the right genre formula and it did everything right according to that genre. We don't typically think of movies in quite that way, but we still use genre to understand them and ultimately, to evaluate them. So thinking about our modern sort of moment, the book does look ahead. It's kind of funny because, again, it's very dated, but we can update a little bit of what they're talking about. They predict that in the future, genres will largely be driven by audiences. Back in the golden era of Hollywood, genres were largely created by writers, studio executives, and also distributors and exhibitors. But they were saying in the future, audiences are going to have more of a say in the types of genres that exist, and also in how those genres operate. So I think we can probably agree that that's true. in the modern day. They mention as potential reasons for that the fragmentation of media. And we all have sort of observed that, it's not just movies and maybe a few stations on TV and radio anymore. We have so many other media options with, digital technologies, streaming services, right? So we understand there's a lot of different kinds of media. There's not just like three types or three major types like there might have been a century ago or even 50 to 75 years ago. And also the ability to target specific audiences. And again, we see that today. Audiences are more specialized and there's more sophisticated ways for media to reach specialized audiences. Again, the internet has a lot to do with that. And they also mention things like satellite transmission. This is a quote. Satellite transmission, electronic mail, email, facsimile machines, they mean fax machines, which are already obsolete today, and cellular phones as examples of the kinds of technology that's going to make it harder for filmmakers and film executives to set the terms of genre. They're saying in the future, audience will get to decide, right? Audiences will drive genre development. And the viewing patterns of audiences will really dictate what kinds of genres we have in the future. So if we want to think about newer genres that maybe didn't exist in the 30s, but they do exist now, ask yourself, do those genres exist because they're sort of responding to things that audiences want? Because that's the prediction, and I think it's probably true. So I wanted to spend a little bit of time on this whole semantic and syntax thing, because the way it's presented in the book, I think, is very confusing, and I thought it might be helpful if I broke it down a little bit. It's fine if you already understand it, but I thought it was done in a way that made it kind of hard to grasp. I thought I could break it down, and this is a good thing to do. I like to do this anyway, even though this is not technically an English class. This is a very English thing to do. Think about words and sentences, because that's really all they're talking about here when they talk about semantics and syntax. So they talk about the semantic elements of individual movies and how different genres made use of different semantic elements. So they give, again, examples from the Western. So they're saying semantic elements, again, semantics really just refers to the meaning of individual words if we're talking about language. So we won't get too far into linguistics here, but that's really what it means to talk about semantics. If you say that people are arguing about semantics, that means that they are arguing about what a particular word means or what multiple words mean. But when we talk semantics, we are really on the level of the individual word, one of the most basic units of language and speech. So they talk about semantic elements. So like for a Western, that would be like horses. we generally see horses in Westerns. Rough and tumble characters. That's pretty broad. That could mean like outlaws or maybe like scruffy lawmen. Often illegal acts, like we saw in the Great Train Robbery. Wilderness, tracking shots. So notice some of these things are technical elements, like a certain type of camera shot. Natural earth colors was one that they mentioned. I would add like sweeping vistas of, mountains or deserts. Those are technical aspects, technical elements. They also mention horses and certain character types that we expect to find. Certain plot points, illegal acts, right? A certain kind of setting. We're in a wilderness area or a partially settled area where there's still maybe lawlessness or lots of conflict, right? So some of these things refer to plot. Some of these semantic elements refer to character. Some refer to, technical things, but they're all like individual words. They're all little individual elements that you would expect to find in a Western. Okay? That makes sense. And then we have syntax. So syntax in a linguistic sense just refers to sentence structure. It's the way that we take all of these individual semantic elements, these individual words, and put them together into a larger sentence. And that sentence becomes the syntax, right? And as the book talks about, it's a shared syntax if we're talking about movies, right? Because once a movie puts all of those semantic elements together, right, they are expressing something larger. We can kind of think about this as more like thematic material, the theme that's being expressed, the larger meaning that's being expressed by the movie is often going to be a collection of those semantic elements. But what syntax is all about is putting those individual elements together in a way that makes sense. So how would you do that in a movie? You take all those elements and you put them together through plot patterns, through certain metaphors or symbolism, through certain visual choices, and ultimately through the expression of theme. So that's what they're talking about, and I would recommend just thinking about this as being like words in a sentence. So we have think about any sentence. This is a cool thing to consider about language, just for a moment. It might seem a little obvious, but we don't often slow down and really think about it. Think about any sentence in any language. It really doesn't matter what the language is. Think about any sentence. Within that sentence are a whole bunch of individual words. Right? We know that. And each one of those words has its own meaning. So it's kind of remarkable that we're able to put all of those words together in one sentence that makes sense. Because each of those words can be used in different ways, right? There's not just one way that we can put them together. We have to figure out the best way or our preferred way to put them together, and that's how we write an actual sentence. We collect a bunch of individual semantic elements and we put them into a sentence, and we're able to use all those individual words that have their own individual meanings to express a larger, more coherent meaning. That's the sort of cognitive move that's so cool that we often don't think about, but we do it all the time. Right? Because again, each individual word has its own meaning, but then the meaning of the sentence is ultimately greater. The sum is greater than its parts, right? So we make that move. We take all those semantic elements and we put them together in a way that makes sense. And that's what movies are doing. Right? So a Western takes all of those individual semantic elements, which could mean a lot of different things, but they put them together in a pretty familiar, formulaic way. And they're often expressing similar types of themes about the conflict between wilderness and civilization, the heroism of Western settlers, whatever. So it's not just the case that when you sit down to watch a Western, you expect to find those certain elements. Sure, you do. But you also expect that certain kind of syntax. You expect the larger sentence that expresses these larger metaphors or talks about these larger meanings that all the elements are supposed to add up to. So that's how genre works. We look for the individual semantic elements, but we also participate in this shared syntax, where as viewers, when we go into a Western, we expect that Western to tell us certain things, to have certain kinds of messages or meanings, because a lot of them had very similar syntax. Okay, so hopefully that makes sense. But what happens later, especially after the fall of the Hollywood studio system, is you have increasingly movies that are using these familiar semantic elements, but they are creating new syntax. They're doing new things, different things with the familiar semantic elements. So it's like taking the same words, but doing different things with them, using those words to express different things. So again, they use the example of Westerns after World War II. And I think it's even more pronounced with Westerns from like the 1960s and even up into the 70s after the fall of the Hollywood system. We'll get to that in weeks to come. But what they point out is that increasingly Westerns became a little bit more complicated on the level of syntax. They started to express more complicated themes about the settlement of the West. Was it good? Was it fair and equitable or just? Exploring relationships with Native Americans, thinking more critically about westward expansion and kind of how it worked. So the semantic elements remain the same. We still have horses. We still have grand vistas of mountains and deserts. We still have rough and tumble characters. We have crime. We have earth tone colors. We have tracking shots. We have all those same semantic elements, but now those individual words or elements are being put to a different use. They're expressing different ideas. They're expressing much more critical or ambivalent attitudes about like the way the West was won, so to speak. So the semantic elements stay the same, but the syntax changes. That larger thematic material changes. And it's like, okay, now we have a different message, but you can still recognize these as Westerns. But they're different kinds of Westerns. They're post-war Westerns, or sometimes they're called revisionist Westerns. You can really see this play out by the 70s or like the late 60s. You know, watch The Wild Bunch, directed by Sam Peckinpah, if you like Westerns, or Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. These are Westerns. They have a lot of those traditional semantic elements that would characterize them as Westerns, but they are expressing a very different meaning. They have a very different syntax compared to the old classic John Wayne Westerns that my dad watched throughout my childhood. So if you know Westerns, this makes a lot of sense, but this also happens with other genres, right? So they talk about, like, in the future, you're going to have more and more movies taking these familiar semantic elements, but creating new syntax. And again, that's kind of what we see with horror movies that are so self-referential now. They're so meta. They're very self-aware, but they're still using those familiar horror elements. The jump cuts. Oh, it's just a cat, but next time it's the serial killer or the slasher. The teens, the scary music, certain kinds of settings, certain kinds of camera work, certain kinds of lighting, certain kinds of plots. But now we can do slightly different stuff with those semantic elements. So in the book, they claim in the future we're going to have more generic parodies, like kind of having fun with or maybe even making fun of the genre conventions. Or they say maybe we'll have more mixed genre films. And I think you guys should be able to find evidence of that happening, because we have a lot of mixed genre films today. Films that take a little bit from horror. They take a little bit from comedy. They take a little bit maybe from romance, and they put it all together in one big pot, because we're not as bound to, rigid genres anymore. Like, I think we like a certain amount of mixing, cross-pollination. So look for some evidence in contemporary movies. They're a little bit of this genre, they're a little bit of that genre, and maybe they're a little bit of this other genre as well. We can probably find that. And also, like we said, we'll see more examples of film genres trying to use that familiar semantic material to create new syntax, to create new, larger meanings using those familiar elements. But again, it's still that kind of move is still playing on audience expectations. They want to give us what we expect to a certain extent to kind of, lure us in, but then they might have a surprise for us. They might upset our expectations later, or they might give us a different meaning, a different message to chew on by the end. Okay, so let's wrap up by talking a little bit about the Marx Brothers. Just an example of a very popular genre that existed throughout the 20s, 30s, and 40s. But like I said before, this is a type of comedy that we might not necessarily see anymore. Some genres go away, others persist. I would like to hear what you guys think. We see comedies all the time. I mean, there's still a lot of comedies getting made. But if we're trying to describe this particular style of comedy, it might seem a little bit dated or a little bit old-fashioned. There's a few different sort of elements at work here. So we can identify slapstick. That's a very physical style of comedy that's definitely on display here, but also satire and a certain like verbal playfulness. I wouldn't say there's as much satire in A Night in Casablanca, but the Marx Brothers were known for satire in other movies. A satire is a particular type of comedy that normally sort of criticizes or lampoons rich or powerful or influential people, or even just like social structures and norms. It's kind of a way to criticize things that might be wrong or that the author has a problem with, and, you know, kind of calling attention to the problem, but in a comical way. So nowadays, I think satire just kind of has seeped into so many different movies and books. I don't know that we really separate it as a sort of genre unto itself. It might be thought of as still like a type of comedy, but I would argue a lot of comedies incorporate elements of satire, elements of farce, and also elements of slapstick. But there was a time when these would have been thought of as kind of separate. But, you know, I think now they all kind of fall under the general heading of comedy. There's lots of puns and wordplay, particularly from Groucho, who plays Ronald, Cornblow, the protagonist of the movie. So in case you guys, I'm sure you've looked at the cast by now, but keep in mind, the Marx Brothers are not playing brothers in the movie. They were brothers in real life, but they're playing different roles. So Groucho is Ronald Cornblow. Harpo plays Rusty, the sort of mute. Initially, he's like the servant to the Nazi guy, but then he doesn't seem to be doing that later. But that's Harpo, and then Chico is Carpaccio, the sort of vaguely Italian hustler who ends up falling in with these other two guys. So those are the brothers, and they appeared in several films going all the way back to the 20s, even before sound. They were right there at the advent of sound movies, and they really hit their peak popularity, like I said, during the 1930s. That's when they made their best films like Duck Soup and A Night at the Opera. We're catching them here in the 40s. They're a little bit past their prime. They had actually just come off about a 5-year hiatus where they had not been making any movies. They had been doing some radio stuff, and they were sort of coaxed back to do another film. They were not working with the original studio that they had worked with anymore. This was actually a kind of independent production, ultimately put out by United Artists, which was one of the major studios, but they kind of specialized in more independent productions that they would then buy and sell to be exhibited. So a lot of critics and scholars would not consider this to be the Marx Brothers at their finest, but we do see some key characteristics of their brand of comedy. We get a lot of the slapstick from Harpo, because he typically performed as a mute, like he did not speak in most of their performances. So a lot of his comedy was physical and purely visual, whereas a lot of Groucho's humor is derived from verbal wordplay. And like I said, puns and just sort of, funny ways of using the language. But we also get a lot of sight gags, which I would say are less common today in comedy than they were back then. A sight gag is just humor conveyed solely through visuals with no words. So as you can imagine, a lot of silent comedy relied heavily on sight gags. And the Marx Brothers got their start in vaudeville. And then they were around, I think, a little bit during the silent era. And then, like I said, right as sound took off. So in many ways, they are a throwback to an earlier era of comedy, where there was more slapstick, there was, there were more sight gags. But just to think about like that whole sequence with the toupee that we see early in the film, where Rusty accidentally like vacuums the Nazi's toupee off of his head. We really don't have any words, at least not coming from Harpo. That's all conveyed really visually through a sight gag. Also, I think there's a moment with the champagne bottle where they pull out the cork and it's just like impossibly long. Then I think Harpo might even start like smoking it like it's a cigarette. That's a sight gag. Okay, and we see several of those throughout the film. Even some of the most beloved set pieces from the Marx Brothers could be considered just largely like visual or physical humor with very little reliance on words. So my favorite scene in the whole movie is where they're kind of trying to make the Nazi guy go crazy, and he's packing up all of his stuff trying to escape, and the brothers get into his hotel room and they're like hiding his clothes and they're doing all this stuff to confuse him, and they're hiding variously in like closets and under the desk, and they're doing all of this physical humor. And even though we do get dialogue during that scene, we hear the Nazi and his henchmen talk, but we don't hear the Marx Brothers talk. And they're the ones delivering most of the comedy, and they're doing it through physical actions, through sort of this physical style of comedy. But we also get plenty of verbal comedy as well. But one of the reasons I picked this particular movie instead of one of their best ones was because it really plays on genre. So I'll finish up just quickly here by mentioning the classic film Casablanca, which comes out in 1942, just a few years before this Marx Brothers picture. And many of you are probably at least familiar with Casablanca, even if you haven't watched it yourself. But that's a certain genre. And it would largely be considered a romance. It largely centers around the romance between the Humphrey Bogart and Ingrid Bergman characters. But there was also a lot of international intrigue and sort of an exotic setting, and there were Nazi villains, and a lot of those elements show up in this film, which is kind of loosely parodying those things. So again, that's what the book means when it says, eventually genres become the subject of parody. Like sort of getting made fun of, again, those familiar semantic elements are being used, but now they're being used for laughs. We're not really supposed to take them seriously. But as a lot of reviewers at the time pointed out, and critics will continue to say it, like, the movie doesn't really have anything to do with the original Casablanca. They're just borrowing certain elements, not only from that film, but from the larger genre that it belongs to. Again, certain semantic elements like the setting, the Nazi villains. There's even a very half-hearted romance between two characters, not the brothers, but between Pierre, who I think is supposed to be French, but he's just played by this American actor who's making no attempt at a French accent, and Annette, his girlfriend, who I guess is also supposed to be French, but really doesn't seem to be. They're just, playing it like Americans. But nobody cares about them. Like that subplot is very underdeveloped and kind of insignificant, but it's just one of those semantic elements that they're picking up on and saying, okay, yeah, we would expect a love story. We have the exotic setting. We have the international intrigue. We have the certain kinds of villains. And we have the American guy who's on the scene trying to put it right, sort of like Humphrey Bogart in the original. But again, it's really not similar to the original film at all. But there are certain genre conventions of a certain type of thriller romance that was popular back then that the movie is playing with. But what you should keep in mind, again, is all about audience expectation. So the makers of the movie and the Marx Brothers themselves are assuming that audiences have seen Casablanca, that audiences are familiar with this genre. They are familiar with the basic semantic elements of this genre. If you don't know anything about the genre, you're not going to maybe fully appreciate the film. So even in the 40s, we already see filmmakers start to have fun and make fun of genre conventions and sort of use those familiar semantic elements to create different syntax. In this case, it's all about a comedic vehicle for the brothers. But there's a few kind of cool touches, again, that don't really show up as much in modern day comedies, but they were characteristic of a lot of Marx Brother comedies. These guys, well, at least a couple of them, were pretty accomplished musicians, as you might have noticed in the film. So Harpo really did play the harp, and he was quite an accomplished player. So we have that scene. It kind of serves a plot point because he's accidentally stumbled upon the treasure that the Nazis are trying to smuggle out of there or whatever. But really, it's just a set piece so we can listen to him play the harp, right? And it's kind of beautiful. And then there's that earlier scene with Carpaccio, Chico playing the piano. And Chico was what was kind of referred to as a trick piano player. Like, he wasn't a real, classically trained pianist, but he could play. But largely the way he played was kind of meant for visual fun, and it was meant to be kind of funny. And he would do it as part of his act when they started out on stage, before their film careers. So you don't necessarily have a lot of musical interludes in contemporary comedy, but that was a feature of Marx Brothers films because they happen to, incorporate music. But again, that's a throwback to vaudeville and a much earlier era of comedy. But you might notice some things that are modern in the film. Not only its use of genre, but also some of the lines, some of the verbal humor, maybe even some of the slapstick is still with us today. And if you have time to check out Duck Soup, you'll get much more satire. That's much more about sort of making fun of a particular sort of ruling class, government, people who will, often start wars, rulers, leaders, dictators. It's very much more satirical in a way that other great comedians of this era were, like Buster Keaton and Charlie Chaplin earlier. The Marx Brothers kind of come out of that tradition as well. But again, they're kind of putting all of this together in a stew that we still enjoy. Some satire, some physical comedy, verbal comedy, a little bit of a send-up of a particular genre, and they would do that in other films as well. And they're still largely appreciated by scholars, by critics. A lot of regular people don't really watch movies from that era, might not be that familiar with the Marx Brothers, so I just wanted to acquaint you guys with them. If you like them, great. Check out some more of their stuff. If you don't like it, that's okay. At least you've experienced it. Okay, so that's it for this week. I'll see you next time.